Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to ETHS. More importantly, welcome to this fan presentation. I'm Eric Witherspoon. I'm the superintendent here at ETHS, and we're so thrilled to see a lot of folks that we regularly see at these fan events, not only Evanstonians, but folks from neighboring communities and partners in this just wonderful, wonderful programming that we have. I think that tonight's programming speaks for itself to see this wonderful turnout on a night like this. To think that you understood this is too important to miss, even if it takes a few more layers of clothing to get here. So thank you for coming. I know you're in for an amazing evening, and I know that we all are going to learn a lot, and we're also going to be able to tell people we got to hear this presentation. It's my honor to introduce the Executive Director of FAN, Lonnie Stonich.
Good evening, everybody. Thanks for coming, as Eric said, on this night. Sounds like we're going to have a lot of these kinds of nights, so I'm getting a couple emails, people wondering if programs are canceled because of cold. They will almost never be canceled because of cold. They will only be canceled if a speaker can't get in because of a blizzard, or if we have such terrible road conditions that the schools advise us to cancel a program. So if the thought goes through your head, is it too cold for a fan program? The answer is no. It's not. So, again, many thanks to the FAN board, our school liaisons, and the members of our FAN Squared donor group. Thanks to them. Their contributions make all our programming free and open to the public. Special thanks to our friend Eric Witherspoon, to ETHS Assistant Superintendent Principal Dr. Marcus Campbell, who is also a FAN board member, and to the ETHS staff, who we love so much on all levels for these events. Tonight's event sponsors include Chiaravalli Montessori School, Connections for the Homeless, Evanston Township High School 202, New Trier Township High School District 203, Youth and Opportunity United, YOU, and the YWCA of Evanston North Shore. Thanks to all of them. You were given, yay, all of them. You were handed a broadsheet as you walked in. Inside is a survey. If you wouldn't mind filling out the survey at the conclusion, there'll be people at the doors to collect those. We do read them, usually within a day of receiving them, so please give us your feedback. If you would quiet your cell phones at this point. The format, Dr. Campbell and Professor Blight will be on stage together. I think, Dr. Campbell, you're going to probably go about an hour, he said. 40 minutes. It's somewhere between 40 and 60 minutes. And then we'll take Q&A from the audience, and then we'll be personalizing books out in the hallway. Dr. Blight will be doing that, Professor Blight. They are already signed, so in case you need to dash back or get home, a babysitter, whatever it might be, there are signed copies available in case you need to leave early. The last program of January, next Wednesday, also in the same room and downtown during the day, we're thrilled to host Dr. Ibu Patel, who is the founder and president of Interfaith Youth Corps in Chicago, who probably many of you are familiar with. His new book, Out of Many Faiths, Religious Diversity and the American Promise, next Wednesday, 12 o'clock at Loyola Law School downtown, 7 o'clock right here. Dr. Marcus Campbell has served as the Assistant Superintendent Principal at ETHS since 2013. In this role, he serves as the educational leader and chief administrator of all school operations and implements and manages, straight from the website, sorry, that was a little too hearty of a chuckle. The policies, regulations, and procedures of the Board of Education, ensuring that all students are educated and supported in a safe, equitable, culturally relevant, and student-centered learning environment. Go Kits! My son's a senior here. Cue music. Dr. Campbell earned his doctorate in educational leadership at National College of Education, National Louis University. He also holds a master's degree in social and cultural foundations in education from DePaul and a BA from the University of Illinois with a major in English and a minor in African American studies. That's Dr. Campbell. David Blight is a teacher, scholar, and public historian at Yale University. He is class of 1954 professor of American history and director of the Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery, Resistance, and Abolition. In his capacity as director of the center, Professor Blight organizes conferences, working groups, lectures, and administering of the annual Frederick Douglass Book Prize, and many public outreach programs regarding the history of slavery and its abolition. Professor Blight's latest book is Frederick Douglass, Prophet of Freedom. He is also the author of a dozen other books, including Race and Reunion, The Civil War in American Memory, which received 8 book awards, including the Bancroft Prize, the Abraham Lincoln Prize, and the Frederick Douglass Prize, as well as 4 awards from the Organization of American Historians. Professor Blight is also a frequent book reviewer for the New York Times, the Washington Post Book World, the Chicago Tribune, the Los Angeles Times, the San Francisco Chronicle, and the Boston Globe, Slate.com, and other newspapers, and has written many articles on abolitionism, American historical memory, and African American intellectual and cultural history. He works in many capacities in the world of public history, including on boards of museums and historical societies, and as a member of a small team of advisors to the 9/11 Memorial and Museum team of curators. For that institution, he wrote the recently published essay, Will It Rise? September 11 in American Memory. In 2012, Professor Blight was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and delivered an induction address titled, The Pleasure and Pain of History. And important to mention, for 7 years, he taught American history at a public high school in Flint, Michigan. Ladies and gentlemen, my true pleasure, Professor David Blight, Dr. Marcus Campbell.
Good evening, Dr. Blight.
Good evening.
Good evening,
Thanks,
everyone
Marcus.
here.
Thank you all for coming on a horrible night.
Welcome to Evanston, welcome to Chicago. Most importantly, welcome to Evanston Township High School.
It's a thrill to be here. I've had friends who've gone to this school of various vintages, and they always say it's the best school they ever went to. Yes. Even if they went to the University of Chicago.
That was great. You came in and you said, oh, this is the famous Evanston Township High School. I said, yes, it is.
It's at Carnegie Hall.
Well, thank you for being here this evening.
You're welcome.
There's so much that we can get into tonight. The text is about 764 pages, and it's just
It's
page,
long. It's long.
page to page, it's a remarkable text.
Thank you.
So what makes this biography about Frederick Douglass different from other texts about him, as well as his 3 autobiographies?
Wow. Well, one significant difference, there are many, but one significant difference is that I would never have written this book had I not encountered a private collection of documents and manuscripts owned by an extraordinary collector named Walter Evans, who lives, of all places, in Savannah, Georgia. And to make a long story short, I went to Savannah it turns out 12 years ago, to give a talk to high school teachers about Douglass's narrative, which I hear you read here. And that day, my host at the Georgia Historical Society said, there's this local collector that wants to meet you. He wants to show you some of his stuff. And I probably had that reaction of, all right. But later that day, he took me over to his house, got out on his dining room table his Douglass collection, and it is truly extraordinary. And for a scholar of Douglass, I had written a first book on Douglass, I had edited editions of his autobiographies, I had written essays on Douglass, but I had Douglass out of my life by then. He was gone, he wasn't bothering me anymore. But that day I saw the Evans collection. I was not the first to ever see it, but I'm the first to use it. Now several Douglass scholars have used it. And it opened up particularly the latter third of Douglass's life, the older Douglass, the post-Civil War Douglass, the Douglass who lives 30 years after emancipation as never before. The Evans collection consists especially of about 10 huge family scrapbooks that were kept by Douglass's sons over the last third of their father's life. Thousands upon thousands of newspaper clippings, lots of family letters and family documents. But it particularly opens a window into this older Douglas, the patriarch, the man who led a huge extended family of 4 surviving adult children, 21 grandchildren, at least 3 fictive siblings who adopted him or he adopted them, and a variety of other hangers-on who were all dependent on him financially. It's also the older Douglas who becomes, the old radical who becomes a political insider in the latter part of his life. And I ended up finding the older Douglas, maybe it's because I'm getting older, to be increasingly fascinating. And it's that part of Douglas's life that I have had much new to say about. If Americans tend to know Douglas, it's largely only the younger Douglas, the heroic escaped slave of the narrative, the great orator who, launches his career in the 1840s and 1850s. And they may even know the Douglas of the Civil War period, possibly. But hardly anyone seems to know this older Douglas, this fascinating old man eloquent, as he was called, who never stopped traveling the country as an orator, in part because he needed the money to support that large extended family, but also because he always had much to say. So anyway, I'd have never written this had I not encountered that collector. And by the way, Walter Evans, this collector, is an extraordinary man. He's an African-American retired surgeon who grew up in segregated Savannah, but he came north for his higher ed. He did his medical school at the University of Michigan, practiced as a general surgeon in Detroit for some 35 years, but his passion in life, as he once said to me, other than doing hysterectomies, which really make a lot of money, that's the way he talks. His passion has always been collecting African-American rare books, manuscripts, and art. And when he retired, he moved back to Savannah, and he has this collection in this beautiful 4-story brownstone house. And I spent at least 4 or 5 spring breaks and a number of other weeks in Savannah doing research on the Evans' dining room table, which is about the nicest archive I've ever worked in. They only had 2 rules, by the way. One was, don't come before 8 a.m. That was fine. The other was, never put your coffee cup on the table with the documents, which was fine too. And I never broke that rule. And those of you who have the book will note that I dedicated the book to Walter and Linda Evans. So that's a claim to originality simply because I found new documents.
And it took you 10 years to write the book.
Yeah, I was writing another book at the same time, but yeah, this took a long time. I don't even believe it's really done now myself, but it's there. It must be.
So we're at school. Can you talk about your writing process?
Yeah, the writing process. It's always idiosyncratic, isn't it? We're all different in how we write. I have to have the right space. I tend to write only in my office. Although I spent a year in England at the University of Cambridge, where I actually wrote at home, because the office they gave me was nothing to write home about. And I had this beautiful apartment with a nice bay window and a little study, and I wrote 8 chapters, a chapter a month while I was in England. But I need the right space. I need my notes in one place. I need the right books in one place. And you're going to find this ridiculous. I need those flat toothpicks. Something dent. What are they called? You know, the little flat ones. I'm sorry, I chew toothpicks when I'm writing. I gotta have them. They're my tension release. You know, you can chew pens, but that doesn't get it. I gotta have the right toothpicks. But seriously, my writing process tends to be outlining on paper. I outline a lot on pads of paper. And then I compose on the computer. I didn't always do that, of course, because I'm old enough to have written before we had computers. But it's, for me, I have one other thing I do, and everybody does this differently. I read my way to writing. if I'm having a writing day, which means, days on end of writing, summers of writing, I will start the day by rereading what I wrote yesterday. If I had a good 3 to 5 page day the previous day, I reread all of that, and you revise a lot. That's how you revise. You revisit that. You hated that verb yesterday when you used it, but you couldn't think of anything better. And now you got it, maybe. But I also sometimes will just take the first half hour to an hour and read something else. Maybe Douglas's voice, in this case, maybe something else. If I'm writing about, whatever, Douglas and the Grant administration, Douglas and the Santo Domingo problem, I may just read some secondary source for a half hour about that. I just try to read into my mind what it is I'm going to write about. I guess on the theory that writing is a flow of words, it's not just these moments of pure inspiration. I don't even know what that is. It's just mind to matter madness. It's work. But I can't function without a good outline either. I also will sometimes, we all have these tricks. When I finish a day of writing, if I know where I'm going next, and I should, I better know where this section is going, I will just put with asterisk bullet points on the bottom of that page on the computer the 3 or 4 things I want to do next. Sometimes it's just that quote I want to remember to use. And sometimes I'll also jot it down on my outline. I'll have 2 versions of where I'm going next. It prompts me the next day. So those are just some of the tricks. It's not put a picture on the wall and stare at it for inspiration. Writing is also just horrible dedication and discipline. And some days you don't have it, and some days you do.
You write beautifully, and
Thank
you also the language of the text really just comes alive in the way that you speak about Douglas, his ups, his downs, his struggles, and all of that. And in the introduction, you say that Douglas was thoroughly and beautifully human. Talk about some examples of Douglas's humanity, and then we'll get to what Baldwin said about Douglas after your comments.
Yeah, it's a surprising Baldwin quote in a way, but not really. Thoroughly human. I think what I meant by that is, I was using that line in the introduction to signal my reader that we're going to once in a while take him off the pedestal. Yes. And Douglas liked being on his pedestal. And he didn't like rivals trying to knock him off. The image of Frederick Douglass in the nearly 170 photographs we have of Douglas is of this beautiful, stern, earnest, well put together man. He had many flaws, he had many troubles, he had at least 2 emotional breakdowns in his life, probably more, 2 that I think can be documented. He also was hypersensitive to slights, whether they were racial slights, and he had a lot of those to deal with, or slights about his lack of education, lack of any schooling whatsoever. He hated these kinds of slights, and he would bristle at them. He also had a certain degree of insecurity at times, deep insecurity about his prowess as a writer, until he developed an amazing skill as a writer. But he didn't walk out of slavery a writer. He walked out of slavery the beginnings of an orator, but not a writer yet. He needed help with that. We all did. None of us walked out of the womb a writer, I don't think. If anybody can prove that somebody can do that, you got a Nobel coming. But he also was deeply human in his ambitions and his struggles and the pain of that struggle to achieve. He achieved more than he could ever have imagined when he was young. But he also became the father of 3 adult sons and 1 adult daughter who struggled like the Dickens to make a living, to live their lives, to keep their families together. He had to deal with this problem of waking up every day by the 1870s and 1880s and wondering if his own children were going to be able to feed their own kids. And that brings the humanity out of a person, and sometimes, a difficult humanity out of them. And he also had 2 marriages, which were both complicated. And then friendships and relationships with 2 other European women, which were deeply complicated. And there's a lot of humanity in that, too.
Well, yeah, I have a list here. I have that his daughter Annie dies in about 1860.
At 11 years old.
At 11 years old. Fred Jr. died in 1892.
His son dies at age 51.
He saw the death of 10 grandchildren. In his
10 or, I actually recounted that. I think it's 11. 11 of 21 grandchildren died in their youth or by their teenage years.
And he had this complicated relationship with the Garrisonians early on, and then some black leaders later on.
Yeah.
And
A lot of rivals.
And yes, and you talk about his relationship with Anna, his wife of 44 years.
Right.
And tell us about his relationship with Julia Griffiths Cross and Adelie Asseling, and then we'll talk about Helen Pitts a little later on.
We're going there first.
We're gonna go. Well,
okay.
let's put up.
Let's
Let's
go
talk
for
about
it.
Baldwin first. Let's put the
No,
Baldwin
that's
up
all
first.
right. Oh.
So Baldwin
Oh, yeah,
says,
Baldwin.
and we'll get to that.
Oh, okay.
Baldwin's Frederick.
We'll get to
Baldwin's-
the women.
We'll get to the women. Frederick Douglass was first of all a man.
Yeah.
Honest within the limitations of his character and his time, quite frequently misguided, sometimes pompous, gifted, but not always a hero, and no saint at all.
Baldwin, as usual, was speaking some straight truth. I love James Baldwin. I'm sure a lot of you do too. He's been undergoing a huge rediscovery, and he should. I wrote a long chapter on Baldwin in a previous book. The context for that really probably doesn't matter, but what he's capturing there is the struggles of life.
Yeah.
The pain of life. And Douglass could be arrogant. He could be pompous. He liked being king of the hill. He had earned it. There really was no one else among African Americans, for that matter. Even among white orators and writers of memoir, there's really no one else like him in the 19th century. But of course, what is the next generation always trying to do? Knock him off. What do generations do to each other? Knock him off. And he pushed back sometimes. And sometimes, I do believe he was a prophet, and I'm more than ready to defend my bold use of that word. But at times he even had to admit he was dead wrong about something, like the Exodus to Kansas, although he never quite admitted that one. I think Baldwin nailed that. And I use it in the introduction just to, I could have had an introduction that just had all these glowing epigrammatic statements about Douglass by all kinds of people over the years, but that wouldn't set the reader up for what's really to come.
And that's kind of why I wanted to start with that tonight,
Sure.
too.
No, I'm glad you did. I'm glad you did.
So Anna Douglass, his wife of 44 years, you mentioned that in his third autobiography, you said in that 620-page recreation of his public life, Anna was one of the other who received exactly one mention, not by name, but as my intended wife and a free woman, who joined him in New York to be married after his escape from slavery. The mother figure at the heart of his home for 44 years, and whose death set him emotionally adrift in the summer and the fall of 1892, remained forever a subject about whom he could not publicly have words.
Right.
Talk about that.
Anna Murray Douglass was born probably about 3 miles from where Frederick Bailey was born. She was from the other side of the Tuckahoe River from where Douglass was born. She was about 3 years older. They probably played at the same mill on the Tuckahoe when they were kids, because that's where all the kids went. They didn't know each other then. He meets her in Baltimore as a teenager. Don't know exactly when. Probably in a church, because Douglass attended at least 4 churches in Baltimore when he was a teenage slave. Anna had a good job if you were a free black woman who had moved from the Eastern Shore rural area to Baltimore. She had a job working as a domestic servant for a white family. About the best gig a young black woman in Baltimore in the 1840s could ever hope for. She was illiterate and remained largely illiterate the rest of her life. This is always the fact that has to be said. I don't think it became the fact that Anna defined herself by any means. Precisely why she remained illiterate, we cannot know. Everyone speculates on it. There are all kinds of theories. She was dyslexic. She was resisting Douglas's world, on and on and on. The theories are all out there, but nobody truly knows. Douglas, his daughter, and even Julia Griffiths, who we'll discuss in a second, tutored her. They even hired tutors to help Anna learn to read and write. She never did. What she was, of course, is a thoroughly domestic woman, raised 5 kids, made Douglas's home, especially when, well, always, but especially when he was gone. And Douglas was gone a great deal of the time. 18 months he was gone in 1845 to 47, off to England. He would communicate with Anna through his daughter, and sometimes with other people, even with neighbors. There'd be a letter saying, tell Anna this, or tell mother that. With time, it became, there's enough evidence of this for sure, a difficult marriage, because with time, the greatest African-American intellectual writer, personality, whatever you want, of the 19th century, who lived a life with a tremendous trouble with fame, was married to a woman he could not and largely did not share his professional world. Anna almost never traveled with him. She did travel once. It was over to Boston when her 2 sons, Louis and Charles, were training with the 54th Massachusetts Regiment at Fort Meigs. She went to Boston, stayed for about 3 days with her daughter and Mr. D, and she just wanted to see her sons one last time before they went off to war. We don't even really know what Anna thought about Douglas recruiting those boys into the Army. I have in my imagination, I don't know that this is true at all, but if some screenwriter ever gets to make this into a movie, and there are a bunch of them supposedly trying, but don't hold your breath, imagine writing a script for Anna.
Right.
You just did what? Oh, Frederick. They not only can be killed, they can be enslaved. I want her reading him the riot act on that, even though he's not going to change his mind, but I'm not the screenwriter. We don't know what she would have said to him when he returned from England and Annie had died. Did she meet him at the door and say, I'll show you the grave? We don't know. She was famous for her garden, her orchards, her Maryland biscuits. People would send her recipes, but she was not part of his public life. But when she died, after a whole series of illnesses and strokes in 1882, he came apart for at least a few months. He went by himself up to Poland Springs, Maine. You've all had Poland Springs bottles in your hands, right? Poland Springs at that point was a resort. Douglas went up there and stayed either at the resort hotel, although there's one letter where he's inquiring with a farmer about, he may have stayed in a farmhouse by himself to just grieve. And thankfully, he wrote a bunch of letters to his daughter and his sons while he was there about that grief. Anna had been, as he said, the post of his house, post of his home. But we should not have any fuzzy imaginations about this. It was, with time, a difficult marriage. Now, we can learn about Anna, and I've done my best in here, from other sources. Namely, their daughter Rosetta wrote a beautiful essay that is very public, that's been around for years, published, I think, in 1903, called My Mother as I Recall Her. And it's amazing. It's actually quite revealing of Anna's personality. Rosetta paints a portrait of her mother as a very stern taskmaster woman who didn't want any drinking in her house, didn't want any screwing around in her house, and didn't actually like people dropping by for social occasions, and that happened way too much at the Douglas house. But also, there are just some beautiful lines in it about how, father came home from England, Rosetta says, and he'd been gone 18 months. They're living in Lynn, Massachusetts, in essentially a cabin. There are 3 kids now. 3. And Rosetta remembered father saying, are you able to pay the bills? How are the accounts? And Rosetta says, mother went to the bureau, pulled out the bank book, the account book, put it in front of her husband and said, it's balanced. Anna could do the numbers. And the reason Anna could at that point is she had taken a job as a shoe binder in Lynn. She'd also taken in wash from her neighbors. She was making money. We also learn about Anna in the Evans collection. There are 2 priceless handwritten narratives by 2 of the sons entitled Growing Up in the Douglas Household. They exist nowhere else but in that collection. And they're also amazing. They're very celebratory of the 2 parents and so on and so forth. But there's a lot of revealing stuff in there too about the personality of their mother. So there are ways to get at Anna, but not enough. And she will forever be a bit of a mystery, especially at times. On the other hand, she endured, and what she endured. So many moves, so many changes, so many hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of long 3- and 4-month lecture tours by her husband, way out in the Middle West, for that matter, even to the plains, and not always knowing exactly even when he'd come back, or if he'd come back, or whether he'd come back with a broken hand because he got attacked by a mob in Indiana, or whether he'd be shot dead by a mob somewhere else. Anna clearly forged her domestic world as her space and endured. I'll say one last thing about that. I can go on all night about this. But when she dies in '82, Douglas is the famous man now. He's a recorder of deeds in the District of Columbia. He's many other things. He's the great Douglas. But when he dies, there's a huge funeral for Anna. And all the other black leaders of the D.C. area elbow each other out of the way to be pallbearers at Douglas's wife's funeral. And the press, in eulogy after eulogy, write eulogies of Anna Murray Douglas, but they're almost all about him. They're about what a great wife she was for the great man. If you want to read into the world of gender in the 19th century, read the obituaries of Anna Douglas. Because they didn't know what else to say about her. She was extraordinarily private. Anyway, I'll leave
I
that
have a
there
couple
for
of
the moment.
photos. One is of the Douglas family tree that you can find at Cedar Hill. For those of you who don't know, Frederick Douglass's house in Washington, D.C., Cedar Hill is a national museum. And that's a picture of the house. Too bad it's not showing up that well with the lights. But some folks here are only familiar with his life as a slave. Let's just kind of briefly talk about that. He's born Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey, 1818, roughly. Thomas All says, he's actually, well, we'll get to the point where in the 1870s, where he goes back to Thomas Auld and says, he goes through the front door. I can't wait to have that conversation.
Sure.
But he really doesn't know who his father is. He has no memory of his mother. He changes his name to Douglas to avoid capture.
Yeah.
As a fugitive slave. And one of the things that I learned about slavery reading this is that he was essentially a toy for Daniel Lloyd and Tommy Auld.
Right.
They're playmates, but he was the slave mate.
Right.
And I didn't know that to this degree of how insidious slavery really worked.
That's why he was first sent to Baltimore.
Yes.
He's 87 years old to be the playmate of Tommy Auld, who was his owner's nephew.
Yeah.
So he made the best of it.
He did, and you write about this, especially when he goes to your commentary about him at Covey's, like that his body was enslaved, but his mind was free, and it was his imagination that kept him pushing and kept him going during those tough times as a slave.
Many times over, Douglas said, he says it in the narrative, he says it in Bondage and Freedom, the second autobiography, he says it many other places, says it in speeches, that, you know, slavery could do great damage to his body, but that wasn't what worried him most. It was what it could do to his mind. And he even went so far as to say he saw lots of his fellow slaves that he felt had minds that had just gone dark, who didn't really live very sentient lives at all. And his greatest fear was losing his emotional and mental control. And in effect, he says, he does lose that when he's under the pressure and the beatings and the violence of this Edward Covey, when he's 17 years old, and he's sent to this Covey who was hired to be, in effect, a kind of a slave breaker, a breaker of recalcitrant teenage slaves. And Covey did, according to Douglas, beat the living hell out of him frequently. And he says Covey won for a while. He beat me into submission. Although, of course, Douglas then makes that the pivot of his story, because he does finally rise up against Covey, takes him on, fights him, beats him up, claiming he fought him for 2 hours.
You also refer to Douglas as a gifted artist.
He's a very gifted writer, and man, he's got you on the edge of your seat there wondering, you know, how long is it going to take to beat this guy up? You know, and did you really have 2 hours? You'd have killed him in 2 hours. But then, of course, he uses that as the pivot of the narrative. If you've read it, you know that. It starts with the line, I've shown you how a man was made a slave, I will now show you how a slave became a man. That's the male narrative of resurrection through violence, through self-defense. But it also, his time with Covey gave us some of his most beautiful writing of that still young part of his life, those metaphors of the sailing ships on the Chesapeake being his imagery of freedom, wishing he was on one of their gallant decks as they fly around the world. I mean, God, you're reading that and you think, this is a novel. Unless you go to Covey's farm and stand out on that ridge, as I have done, and you look out on the Chesapeake Bay on a beautiful day in July, and there they are, white sailing ships. And you realize, as I did the first time I saw it, oh my God, he didn't make that up. That's not just a metaphor. Douglas developed that amazing product of hard work, but nevertheless amazing ability to find in language the emotion, the experience, the nature of enslavement, and many, many other experiences and emotions. But it's early on that he discovers that he's good at language. And that's going to be, in effect, the only weapon he ever had.
1877, he goes back to Thomas Auld.
Yeah.
Frederick Douglass is a 60-year-old man.
Yeah.
And a local reporter mentions that it was the first time that a black man had ever entered the home in St. Michael's by the front door as an honored guest. This is a striking contrast to how Douglass leaves the home as a runaway slave, and he goes back through the front door.
I think that same reporter used language, as you may remember from reading it, saying, you know, he left an N-word and came back, you know, well, yeah.
Yes.
He returns, his first return to the Eastern Shore since 1838 when he escaped, is to visit what he thought was the deathbed of his former owner, Thomas Auld. Turns out Auld lived another year. In St. Michael's. They had about a 25-minute encounter, a paparazzi in tow. The press is with him. And Douglass went in part to ask Auld, are you my father? He tells us that. And Auld didn't say yes. It's one of the reasons I don't think Ald is the father, but I can't prove it. I don't know. Nobody knows.
We speculate that it's Aaron Anthony.
I speculate it's more likely to be Aaron Anthony, but still, we don't know. Although there are people working now to do DNA testing to try to figure this out. I'm just glad it wasn't done before I got the book done. Seriously, because if Douglas didn't know, I didn't want to know. I wanted to keep that in historical time. But anyway, yeah, he has this encounter with Ald, and it's a remarkable encounter. They both wept, according to Douglas. Ald called him Marshal Douglas because he was Marshal of District of Columbia, and Douglas says, "Nah, Frederick to you." I don't know if he called him Thomas, but anyway, they had this encounter. It's old slave owner and old slave. By that time, though, this is extremely important stuff to Douglas. He's trying to figure out who he is. He's trying to figure out who his father was, who he comes from, who his white kin are. And by then, he's actually made close friends with Amanda and Benjamin Ald, who were Ald's son and daughter. Well, friends. They weren't really close, but they corresponded with one another and so on. Douglas is trying to figure out, are these people partly my kin? And always that is across the tortured barrier of having been enslaved by these people, and not to mention, always across that tortured realization that his own birth is probably the result of the sexual violence of a white man against his own mother. Exactly who that white man is partly who he's trying to figure out. So he'll have a number of other returns to the Eastern Shore, none more poignant than that one.
But you're right about him doing this as a way to handle his rage and his anger.
Yes. Yes.
To forgive what was done to him. Frederick Douglass said, and he was criticized for this, he says, Ald was no longer a slaveholder to me either in fact or in spirit.
There was a lot on the black press who didn't like that.
They didn't like
and
that.
He got hammered for that. There was even a story out that he had kneeled at Ald's bed. Douglas had to come out quickly and say, no, I didn't do any kneeling. Again, these are his rivals and enemies who will use anything to get at Douglas. But this was Douglas trying to forgive, trying to find if there was a way to a world of reconciliation with this past, his personal past. He was always against the reconciliation going on in the larger country over slavery and the meaning of the Civil War. But personally, that reconciliation mattered to him because he had lots of kinfolk there on the Eastern Shore. He was just trying to figure out who they are. And by the way, you know this from reading it. On that same visit, he went over to Easton, Maryland. He gave 2 speeches in black churches. Then he rented a carriage and went out to the bend in the Tuckahoe River, which is only a couple miles out of town, walked out through the field, looked for a certain cedar tree that he thought he could remember where his grandma's cabin was, kneeled on the ground in a cold day in November, scooped up handfuls of soil, put it in a sack, and took it back to Washington with him as though he was trying to save some soil from where he was born. And I kind of milked that incident for all it was worth in the book.
Yeah, you say too that Ald looks at him and said, Frederick, I always knew you were too smart to be a slave.
Yeah, if Ald didn't say that, it's a good line. That's Douglas the writer again. We can't be too sure, but I don't doubt that Ald probably said something like that. I mean, look at you, man. You got this big fancy job in the District of Columbia now. You must be something.
So he goes, he's a celebrity, and he's the most traveled, one of the most traveled Americans at the time, he and Mark Twain, I believe that's what you write in the book. He's one of the most photographed Americans at the time, about 160, 170 photographs. Gave you say countless, but tens of thousands of speeches. Right. You talk about his grueling schedule, but as a public figure, when Anna dies, 1882, he marries Helen Pitts, 1884. She's a white woman,
right.
And the press everyone just really went nuts.
They went crazy with it. It's the most scandalous marriage of the 19th century, bar none. I don't know what other one you could point to. The most famous black man in the world marries a white woman 20 years younger. Helen Pitts was a woman from Western New York grew up in a very serious abolitionist family, had a great education. She went to Mount Holyoke College. She, during the Civil War, worked in contraband camps in Washington, D.C. as a teacher and a nurse. She caught malaria, had to go home, wanted to go back. They wouldn't let her because she was so sick. She had real abolitionist credentials. She came to Washington after the war, which a lot of people did, to get jobs. Here she was, this highly educated young woman, trying to find a job or make a career. She lived with her uncle, but one of the jobs she got was as one of the clerks.
Work for him.
She worked for Douglas in the Recorder of Deeds office as one of the 8 people he could hire. The first 4 were his 3 sons and his daughter.
We'll leave that to the book, because I
Right,
didn't want to.
right.
There's one paragraph in there like, oh, this is not good, what's happening
No,
here.
he gets hammered in the press, black and white press, for nepotism, and he ends up finally coming clean publicly and saying, I hired my kids because they need jobs.
And you go through the accounting, too.
Oh, I have the account books that show how badly they needed jobs. But Helen also worked at the desk right next to Rosetta, and they were almost the same age. She's a year older or something. Anyway, on a day in February 1884, a reporter walks into the office and says to Rosetta late in the afternoon, did you realize your father just bought a marriage license down the hall here today? It's City Hall. And Rosetta must have said something like, what? Within an hour or two, they all learned that he and Helen had very privately been married in the home of Francis Grimke, African-American minister, who was very close friends with Douglas. They got married in Grimke's house. They kept the marriage completely secret, probably on the theory that if we're going to take the flak, let's take it afterward, not before. It was never a popular move with his children. They did not own up to Helen very well, especially Rosetta. Helen was 46, Douglas was 66. And one of the most bizarre things that happens in the press coverage of this, that reporters kept making Douglas older and Helen younger. Helen was like 35 before this thing was over, and Douglas was 78 in the press. It was ridiculous what they were doing with this. But he got a lot of heat for this from the black press and letters. Oh, God. He got accused of, treason to his race, although he also had a lot of firm supporters on this, black and white. But frankly, by any account, he and Helen handled it with grace. They basically just kept saying, thank you very much, we'll marry who we wish. Helen paid a price for it. Her parents disowned her. Her mother later came back. Her sister later came back to her. Her father basically never spoke to her again. And by all accounts, I don't think there's any question, the last 11 years of Douglas's life, they had a great marriage. They did an 11-month tour of Europe and the Mediterranean. It was a good gig for both of them. Helen now was the wife who he could share his world with. She traveled with him a lot. Came here to Chicago with him when he came to the World's Fair.
Can't wait to talk about that.
She was very much part of his public life, which only made the scandal that much bigger.
Because they were very public.
They were very public about it. They got photographed together quite a bit. And they read together. The trouble was, Helen moved into Cedar Hill, became the mistress of that house, and fired a couple of the people who were working there, one of whom was the sister of the son-in-law, and the son-in-law sues Douglas very publicly, oh, it's crazy, for back pay for his sister. It's ugly stuff. Families are complicated. Did you ever notice that?
And they settle out of court.
They
but
settle
that
out
was-
of court.
That old Nathan,
He woke up every day from the early to mid-1880s on not knowing what in God's name was going to appear in the paper today about him. And that's why I say in the book that in many ways, Douglas's extended family became the black first family of Washington. Everything they did, good, bad, and ugly, bankruptcies, you name it, it's all in the press.
Let's talk about his many titles. You write that that many blacks at the time, they believed in the Horatio Alger mythology at the time, and that George Ruffin and Douglas's third autobiography was writing this introduction, and there he's just milking that, bootstrapping.
It's just dripping, yeah.
So let's talk about his titles, and I want to know, how do you square, you know, he's a slave, he's a fugitive slave, and I separate those on purpose because, you know, he got caught up in the John Brown as a conspirator and had to flee the country. So he's an orphan, husband, father, grandfather, licensed preacher, lecturer, friend, political advisor, abolitionist, political analyst, Freeman's Bank president, presidential appointee, presidential advisor, first black to be nominated president by the Republican National Convention, 1888, world traveler, mentor, radical, political rival, violinist, right? Howard University trustee, writer, editor, newspaper owner, U.S. minister to Haiti, national, international speaker, superstar, militant, recorder of deeds, laborer, Negro, mulatto, and he's also U.S. Marshal of the District of Columbia. So that's quite a bit of...
Can I borrow that list? That's amazing. Whoa. And by the way, he's also a refugee.
And a refugee, yeah. So
for today's purpose.
He is kind of the...
Yeah.
He's kind of the black Horatio Alger, if you want. But how do you square that with the myth of meritocracy in this country and of his time? How do you put those together as a historian?
Well, you can't help following Douglas's lead on this to some extent, because there are those autobiographies, 1,200 pages of them. And the first problem you face, any biographer of Douglas has always faced this, the first problem you have is that your subject is always there getting in your way. The autobiographies are always there. You're trying to see through them, under them, around them. He's manipulating you on every page. Now, but you can't just follow him, because he's creating that myth. He's creating the myth of the self-made hero. He is heroic. He is partly self-made, but there's a lot of other people who help make him, especially women, from his mother to his grandmother to Sophia Auld, who teaches him his alphabet until she stops, to Anna, who follows him, who is as brave as he was to follow him out of slavery, and I can go on and on. Julia Griffiths, who saves his bacon, and becomes the British woman who becomes his editor, his co-editor on his newspaper, his chief fundraiser, and even bought the mortgage on his house so he could feed his children. There are many people who help make him, but he's always there telling us his own ascension story as a self-made man. I think what you have to do as a biographer is acknowledge that heroic rise to all of these various kinds of positions, acknowledge the ambition, the burning, driving ambition of this man, and I would add to that endurance. I do think one of Douglas's greatest legacies is the way he could endure struggle, failure, horrible obstacles, incredible racism, being Jim Crowed more times than he could ever count, and just keep moving and keep fighting and never, ever give up on those basic American creeds of the Declaration of Independence and of the natural rights tradition. He didn't think those were American. He thought those were for all of humanity. What you can't let yourself do is fall into the myth that he's imposing on you. I think we have to watch that as we read. Douglas's heroic character can overwhelm you at times. And I say it. I mean, I gush at times, especially at his use of language. His brilliance with words deserves the gushing. It's truly, truly special. There really are not too many other American writers and orators who match this kind of power with words. We've had some others, but not too many.
So we're getting short on time, and there's still so much here.
My answers are too long.
Just quickly with Lincoln.
Oh, that guy.
I just said it's complicated. Douglas, he gives a speech in the 1870s and says that Lincoln was the white man's president. But yet at the same time, Lincoln passes away, he gives other speeches in his life really saying that Lincoln was the best person to ever walk the continent of North America.
He created at least 3 different Lincolns in eulogy.
Yes, he did.
Depending on the time
Right.
and the audience.
Right.
Lincoln was very useful. Look, I mean, a martyred Abraham Lincoln, like a martyred John Brown. And I don't mean that word useful in a derogatory way or pejorative way. The martyred Lincoln was extraordinarily useful to black memory, to emancipationist memory. But that speech in 1876 that you're referring to, that I opened the book with, that was I don't remember him precisely now making that decision. I just somehow realized, I got to start this book not on the Tuckahoe River, but somewhere in the story
Yes.
that I can then come back from.
There's just so much here, because in that, you say at that part of the book, read this, right? He gives this speech,
Yeah.
and the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court's there, the Cabinet's there, everybody's
Congress.
there, and no other black
Grant,
man.
Yes. President's there.
Yes, the president's there. No other black man would speak to so many highly ranked government officials other than Barack Obama in 2009. That would be the next time that a black
It's
man
the
would
next
speak.
time a black man had the entire government as his audience. Even when King addressed joint session of Congress, the president and the Supreme Court weren't there. I mean, this gets into crazy details, I know. But Douglas did not miss his chance. That could have been they're dedicating the statue, the famous monument of the standing Lincoln and the kneeling slave, the Freedmen's Memorial, controversial monument. Douglas didn't particularly like it, but he made the most of it.
Because the slave is kneeling to
The
Lincoln.
slave is kneeling, but he turned that speech into a hard, honest statement of just how black folk, at least in his view, had thought about Lincoln until after the Emancipation Proclamation. But even then, how they had to learn to trust it and to trust him. And that's where we get the metaphor in that speech where he says, "My white fellow citizens, you were Abraham Lincoln's children. I and my people were only his stepchildren." He repeats the term, stepchildren. It's also in that speech where he says, Abraham Lincoln was the white man's president. But then in the second half of the speech, brilliantly, Douglas, he so often did this kind of thing. He just made you hurt and squirm in the first part of the speech. And then in the end, he would bring you back up a little bit and give you a reason to still hope. In the second half of that speech, he says, but we had to realize and learn that Lincoln's caution on emancipation probably was the only way it could have been accomplished. And he uses a refrain, under his rule and in due time. He uses it 3 times. Under his rule and in due time, we became free. So that speech has got 2 parts. And I looked in vain, by the way, in the Grant papers. I want to know, what did Grant think of that speech? He's sitting right there.
You said all the white people were squirming in their seats.
Well, they should have been. I wanted to know what Grant thought. Maybe Grant took a nap. I don't know. But I couldn't find anywhere in Grant's papers what he thought of that speech that day.
So you also give, I don't want to call it a definition of racism, but it's the anatomy of racism, I think, where you say racism is sometimes a political maneuver, a strategic position in the face of vicious opposition, a habit of mind entailed upon one's soul, or a structural or institutional force beyond the grasp of individuals.
That's pretty good. I
think that's a really good definition of racism. And so
I'm going to use that again.
I
What
think you
page is
should.
that? It's page 374.
I think you should.
Okay.
Brian Stevenson says,
Yeah.
slavery didn't end in 1865, it just evolved. What are your thoughts about the language in the 13th Amendment and this phenomenon of mass incarceration?
yeah.
And we're getting ready, we're closing, because I know we're over time. but-
Whoa, the 13th, yes. Simple little amendment. First sentence, end slavery forever. Second sentence says, well, except for imprisonment.
Yes.
And the second sentence just says, Congress shall have the power to pass all necessary legislation to enforce this. I think sometimes we give the 13th Amendment a bad rap. A lot of what has happened, there's no question, incarceration for crime or whatever you want to call it is certainly made legal in the 13th Amendment, no question. But a lot of incarceration that kicked in the 20th century comes out of an American urban racial crisis and drug issue, when you think back to the Rockefeller laws, that may or may not have a lot to do with the 13th Amendment. I think sometimes blaming incarceration on the 13th Amendment is sometimes a little bit of a way of deflecting us off of the very real, horrible, recent issues and forces that have caused this incarceration in the past 30 years, 40 years, 50 years. That's just the way I've come to think about it. There's so many people blaming the 13th Amendment. I mean, you know, there are a lot of other causes of incarceration than that one sentence in the 13th Amendment. I guess that's what I would say. But I love Brian Stevenson. He's one of our prophets today. He is a prophetic voice today.
So, as moving right along, Frederick Douglass had an influence over a lot of folks, like Malcolm X.
Malcolm wouldn't have liked that.
No, he
probably.
wouldn't have. However, Malcolm did borrow from Frederick Douglass.
Oh, yeah.
Everybody
does.
Reading the book, Malcolm gives his Battle of the Bullet speech,
Right.
and Frederick Douglass gave that editorial in 1859.
Yeah. Ballad of the Bullet.
Yes.
Yeah.
I had
Same
no idea that
language.
was Douglass. Yeah, it was
Same
just-
language.
So
Same argument.
same argument.
That's right.
100 years later.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's fascinating. So, and W.E.B. Du Bois talks about the color line. Frederick Douglass talks about color madness.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, there's just so many.
They all borrowed whether they knew it or not.
Yes.
Although Du Bois was quite conscious of borrowing from Douglass.
And Paul Laurence Dunbar,
Oh,
he had a relationship with Paul Laurence
He
Dunbar.
took him under his wing
Yes,
as
he
a
did.
young poet. He took him in as a mentee.
Stayed in his house.
He brought him to Washington because he was a starving poet. He got him a job first in the Haitian Pavilion here in Chicago in the World's Fair. And Dunbar would hang around and hand out pamphlets for a few bucks. And then he said, come on to Washington. And he lived in Douglass's house for a while.
Mentor to Ida B. Wells.
Yes, indeed. Well, and Ida did some mentoring back.
Yes, she did.
They had a testy relationship, but an important relationship. That was almost father-daughter, even grandfather-daughter between them.
And some of these folks, like Booker T. Washington, who begged Douglass to come and speak at the Tuskegee Institute.
Oh, yeah. That's a favorite story of mine. I won't tell it, don't worry.
Yeah, and James Weldon Johnson, who saw him from afar, heard him speak.
Saw him as a young teenage kid.
And then
Never forgot it and wrote about it in his autobiography.
And then there's Sojourner Truth, whose grandson also fought with his sons in
Right.
the 54th Massachusetts.
Right.
It's amazing.
And you know, again, back to this Evans collection, one of the things that I got among the dozens and dozens of new things I got from that collection were all these press accounts of people describing Douglass or describing their own reactions, their own emotions when they saw Douglass, and they heard his voice and so on. And it does give you a sense, if you still needed it, of his charisma, power of his language, power of his presence, and already the power of his legend, so to speak, while he was still alive. He probably was one of the most recognizable Americans of the late 19th. I don't know if there's any doubt he was. Partly it was because of the hair and he cultivated his image. But everywhere, he couldn't go anywhere, as we say, without somebody wanting to follow him and ask him some question. And he would get people stopping him on the street who had read his autobiography, and they just would want him to know that. And when you're an author, believe me, that matters.
So lastly, there's so much here too. You talk about Douglass's prophet throughout the text, and I just have a couple of quotes up here
Good.
from Douglass. And this is mostly in the 1890s, to white people, conquer your prejudices.
Right.
Blacks being the victims of the mortgage system.
Yeah.
I mean, just so many things that are applicable.
Very modern stuff.
Yes,
Right,
absolutely.
right.
But I also think about 1893, 1894.
Yep.
It's not ancient history. My great-grandmother was born in 1894 and didn't die until 1994.
Whoa.
I knew my
You knew her.
I knew my great-grandmother. My great-grandmother talked about her grandparents who were slaves, and I'm a kid doing it.
Sure.
She was old my whole life, right? And I distinctively remember her telling me that. I'm like, wow. Me as a 13, 14-year-old kid having a conversation with my great-grandmother about her grandparents who were slaves was profound.
Sure.
There's another gentleman on our staff, he's biracial, his mom is white, his dad's black. On his mother's side, his grandmother's uncle is Nathan Bedford Forrest. So Nathan Bedford Forrest has a black great-nephew who works at this high school.
Do they have reunions? That family's got a problem.
It's just, when Douglas says, why is it that we are excluded from the World's Columbian Exposition, the answer is slavery. We're still healing from slavery.
Oh, absolutely. I'm going to, what's today? I'm going tomorrow to D.C. for 2 days of a gathering, a group of people from, it's an ecumenical religious group, but also a bunch of academics, trying yet again to come up with ideas about healing slavery. Not a simple thing. It isn't going to be done by another, a better monument. It isn't going to be done by all the books we write. It's going to be done by time if it ever is done. But Douglas lives this. He lives the trajectory of this story of from slavery to freedom. But then he is that rare example of a radical reformer. There aren't that many who live to see their cause win. I mean, truly win in the middle of his life. He's only in his 40s at the time of emancipation. But he lives long enough to see his cause, that victory, all but being destroyed in one lifetime.
Yes.
And of course, he comes here to Chicago for the '93 Chicago World's Fair. He's the representative of the nation of Haiti by then. It's a very messy, complicated, racist...
Where Aunt Jemima was born.
Aunt Jemima is born there. They had Watermelon Day for Negro Day. Oh, it was worse than that. But he stuck it out. He insisted on being the voice. He represented Haiti. And it's here that he first gives the lessons of the hour speech. He'd been working on that lynching issue for a while. Yes, partly because Ida B. Wells pushed him, but not only because of that. But that last speech of his life is a very serious analytical critique of why lynching was happening. And he has a 3-part analysis of why lynching is happening, and it hasn't been that much improved on ever since.
And this is at the World's Fair.
He gives it here in Chicago first, takes it on the road after Chicago, and in '93 and '94, it became his staple speech. And he goes out as a very old man with a fiery speech about why lynching is happening in America.
Yeah, we were just chatting about this. It's one of my favorite part in the book, and I'm done. Like at the World's Fair, you take us through this experience with Douglas as this orator who fights for the podium, who's not intimidated. He does it, and he's given the speech. But at this point in time, he's an old man, and he's shaking at the podium when he starts to get heckled.
He's in his dotage. He's already got heart failure. I mean, he dies of a heart attack. I mean, he didn't know he had it. They didn't have much in the way of cardiology yet. So he would tremble sometimes then when you get up.
And as he's speaking, though, I think it's
He gets
Dunbar's there. He gets heckled, and he gets up. He gets this fire again. He throws his glasses down. He throws his hand in his hair.
According to the press, he threw his hand through his hair.
And he just lays
threw
into
down
it.
the spectacles, and he left his text behind, which was a text about, what does the Negro want? Or he'd given this many times. He had it. In fact, later in his life, he always took a text with him to every podium. Some of us know about that problem of getting up at a podium and, what the hell am I talking about? But he got heckled. The audience wasn't with him, and he just broke into this litany
Great climactic
about
moment.
violence in the South, about American racism, about the madness of race prejudice and lynching. And he had them on their feet by the end of it.
And Ida B. Wells comes back and apologizes and said, "I'm so sorry for mentioning this speech. I
Well,
should
she
have."
told him not to give that speech.
She did.
'Cause this was Negro Day.
Yeah.
And she said, "Are you kidding me? We shouldn't go. We should boycott all of this nonsense." And Douglas said, "No, we got to be there." And she came to him after, and said, "I'm sorry. I'm glad you made that speech.
Last thing, this is a picture. Douglas dies February 20th,
Yeah.
7 p.m. at 77. 7 is the biblical number of completion, right? And
I should have had that in the epilogue.
they make this death mask
Yes.
of him
Yes.
that you can find at Cedar Hill, and I debated about putting this in here, but
that's all right.
you can actually probably see me in the, no, you can't on there, which is good. And he dies of a heart attack in this lobby, well, in the foyer of his home.
Right. Yes, he died with Helen right by his side. He collapsed on the floor. The carriage had arrived out front. He was giving another speech that night at a black church in Washington. Always the next speech. And the eulogies went on for weeks and weeks and weeks. There are just hundreds, thousands of them, over and over and over. And I'll just say this, I hope you read the epilogue, read all the way to the end. No spoiler alerts, but a lot of poets weighed in on Douglas, and I couldn't resist using a few of them. I also couldn't resist that story about Rock of Ages, but that's a spoiler alert, I won't go there. And by the way, you're having Ebo Patel next? He is fabulous. I've heard him, I've been on platforms with him. This guy is dynamite. However cold it is next week, you go.
All right, thank you, Dr. Blight, thank you.
You are terrific.
Emma, thank you.
This is great.
Okay, so we're going to do some Q&A. It's about 8:15, so we'll take about 15 minutes of questions. And I think I'm going to be the only person with a microphone, so I'm just going to dash back and forth between the two sides. So who's first? Sir, if you could stand up for me. And keep the microphone close to your mouth.
I have two questions. I have a pretty clear idea of what Grant thought of Douglas, but I have no idea what Douglas thought about Grant, especially his tragic ending and his struggles trying to work for black freedom. The second question is, when this becomes an Academy Award-winning film, who's the lead?
All right, to the second question first. I don't know, and don't hold your breath. Although I used to have a certain feeling for Lawrence Fishburne, but sorry, I really did. Douglas had both public and private feelings about Grant. He campaigned for Grant. He was all in for Grant, both elections, 68 and 72. He resisted the liberal Republicans in 1872, the Sumners and others who tried to dump Grant. Douglas was a stalwart Republican in that sense. Grant and the Republicans had won the war and freed the slaves. He was for Grant. However, Grant appointed him, of course, to the Santo Domingo Commission as a secretary, not as a commissioner. He went to Santo Domingo on the voyage of the USS Tennessee. But when they got back to Washington, Grant held a dinner at the White House for the commissioners, didn't invite Douglas. Bit of a snub. They didn't have, you may have read Chernow's Grant or Ron White's Grant, both recent great biographies, but they did not have much of a personal relationship. Douglas had closer relationships with the later Republican presidents like Hayes, well, initially with Garfield, but Garfield doesn't last very long, and of course with Benjamin Harrison, who appointed him minister to Haiti. He had a lot of correspondence with Harrison. But he didn't have much of a personal relationship with Grant. I think he would have liked to have had one. Grant kept a distance with Douglas.
David, over here. Can you stand up and keep the microphone close to you?
So how credible would you say is Douglas on his portrayal of the institution of slavery?
I'm sorry, did you say how
Credible.
credible
Yeah,
is he
in
on
his book, yeah.
portrayal of slavery? You've probably read the narrative.
We're reading it right now.
Oh, good, okay. Are you writing a paper on that?
No, but we have a final on it. So.
Okay. It is one of the questions, of course, we all examine when teaching the narrative. How credible is this on the nature of slavery? Very credible. Very credible to the nature of Maryland Eastern Shore slavery. And I'll just give you one backup to that. A book was published in 1981 entitled Young Frederick Douglass by the great Dixon Preston, who was a great journalist who retired from journalism to the Eastern Shore and wrote this book about Douglass's early life. And it was Dick Preston who went into the local archives of the Eastern Shore, the Talbot County Records and others. First of all, determined his birthday, but many, many other details of Douglass's narrative. The names, dates, and places in Douglass's narrative are uncannily accurate. The landscapes, the places. Can we verify every event? No. We don't know, for example, the beating of Nellie that he describes in front of her own children. We don't know if that happened. But a lot of other beatings like it happened. And if you ever go visit the White House plantation, go out by yourself, stand under those trees, as I have, and you'll see the flocks of blackbirds fly over that he described from his youth and imagined himself on their wings. They're still there. Every time I've ever gone to the White House, flocks of blackbirds are always there, and I think, God, he didn't make that up either. It was a brutal system. And when he describes the kind of industrial character of the Y plantation, this huge place with all these outbuildings and carriage houses and the small little shops and, the blacksmiths and the sounds of that place, those were indelible memories. That's where he forged his first childhood memories. Anyway, pretty credible.
David, over here. Could you stand up, sir?
Sure.
Keep it close.
Yes, sir.
Yes, I'm wondering if when Dr. King spoke at the Riverside Church in 1967 on the Vietnam War,
Right.
that speech engendered wide hatred
Yes.
throughout the country among conservative people and Americans in the country. I'm wondering if Frederick Douglass's speech in Rochester about the 4th of July would have caused the same kind of outrage.
It surely did. That and many other speeches. In fact, now, of course, it's a different media age, but that speech Douglass had ready-made, reprinted into a pamphlet that he took on the road with. He did this with several other speeches. The man knew about marketing. He had that baby printed up and ready to go as he went out on the circuit, and he sold it for 50 cents. Now, I can tell you of other instances later, in the 50s, but especially in the war years, Douglass's name in the South became synonymous with radical abolitionism. So had Garrison's earlier. But and so often Douglass's name would appear in Southern papers when they needed to condemn abolitionists or, for that matter, condemn Republicans. They would always call him Fred Douglass and never use the full name. And Douglass hated that, by the way. There's one instance reported in the press, a woman comes up to him and says, "Fred Douglass, I have something to say to you." And he stopped her and he said, "That'll be Frederick, madam." But nevertheless, his very name became kind of synonymous with Northern radicalism, Northern abolitionism, and so on, such that we know how far-flung his fame was, but also his arguments. And when he published something like The Letter to My Old Master in 1848, I know you love that document, he publishes this public, 4 or 5-page letter about his former owner, Thomas Auld. This is after he has his freedom. After the Auld brothers have sold him to his British friends and he's free, he uses Thomas Auld as propaganda And in Maryland, he gets several letters from people vouching for Thomas Auld. He's not as bad as you say he is, and so on and so forth. Douglas loved that kind of reaction. In fact, he learned a lot of that from the Garrisonians. Because one of William Lloyd Garrison's method, and Douglas made it his own, was to judge your success by the ire of your audience.
Okay. Oh,
I could give you other examples of how far-flung his name became synonymously with abolitionism. And in Britain, oh my God, in Scotland, they wrote poems and songs about him. Anyway,
okay.
great question.
Keep it close to you.
How did you get started writing so much about Frederick Douglass?
To be quick, I never learned anything about Douglas that I can remember in college.
Take it from the other side, because they've been on this
I'm
side.
sorry. But I did take the first ever African-American, it was called Black History, course at Michigan State, where I was an undergraduate, go Sparty, in 68 or 69. I can't remember exactly which year. It was taught by Leslie Rout, who was African-American, but he was a Brazilianist. You know, he wrote about South American history. He wrote books on Perón, but they basically said to him, Les, you're black, teach the course, because they didn't have any other black faculty. And Douglas surely must have come up in that course, but we didn't read the narrative. I didn't read the narrative till I was a high school teacher in the 70s in Flint. But I don't think we assigned it to students yet. It was in graduate school that I got serious about Douglas. I went to graduate school at the University of Wisconsin, just up the road. And to make that long story short, I wanted to work on abolitionism. I wanted to work on black abolitionism. I wanted to work on the coming of the Civil War and all those things. And I first started out to write a dissertation on James McCune Smith, who writes the introduction to Douglas's second autobiography. McCune Smith was the most highly educated African-American of the 19th century. He was a brilliant man. He wrote in all kinds of genres. And I wrote an essay, my first published essay on Smith, but there just wasn't enough material to sustain a biography. And hence I landed on Douglas as a dissertation, because Douglas left so much material to work with. And then I was hooked. And I couldn't get him out of my life. And I had him out of my life until Walter Evans. And Walter almost ruined my life by putting me. So, you know, the same reason anybody comes to any topic. You try it out, you learn something about it, you learn more about it and more about it, and you get enthralled with your subject, you hope. You have a passion for that subject. You need to love your subject if you don't necessarily love the person, if you're doing biography. You can fall in love too much with your biographical subject. But to write a whole book, you better have a passion for it.
David, right here, we're going to take this question, and then I have to end with Chucky. Then we'll be at about 8, almost probably 35 at that point.
Okay.
We're going to do the book signing out in the hallway.
Okay, thank you.
I hope you don't mind a little bit of a left turn away from Douglas for a moment and talk about a little bit about a book you wrote. Part of the title was Civil War and American Memory, Race and Reunion, I think.
Sure.
And earlier in this discussion, you mentioned going to D.C. to discuss with clergy ways to heal from the Civil War, from slavery. It brings to mind the issue of the Confederate monuments, very much a part of history, erected maybe much later after the war. How do you see those monuments and how they should be disposed of or viewed, or your thoughts on that issue?
Sure. The last 2 to 3 years, 3 years really, has been an unprecedented, extraordinary time for this subject. Most of us in this business, this field of, you know, the history of the Civil War era and slavery and its aftermath, never thought we would see the Confederate flag come down in South Carolina. Never thought we would live to see such a widespread debate about whether Confederate monuments ought to stay on our landscape or not. But let's remember why that happened. It happened because of a mass murder in a black church in Charleston. It really did. In the wake of Charleston, and then later, 2 years later, in in the wake of Charlottesville. Charleston was June of 2015. Charlottesville is August of 17. Historians, lowly historians like us, have never, and there are a few here tonight, have never had requests from the press to talk about these kinds of issues like we have in this moment. Why? Because violence made us face this. Violence, horrific violence, caused a situation where we could not face it. But there were those hundreds and hundreds of Confederate monuments on our landscape waiting for us to debate them. They'd been debated before, here and there, in local ways, sometimes. But it has caused a reckoning. I don't know where it's going, for sure. It's very local in some ways. All memory is local to some extent. You know what Mitch Landrieu did in New Orleans? Just took down those 4 major Confederate monuments. Well, one of them is actually a Reconstruction monument. That was the worst. But in other cities, they've begun to find other ways of dealing with this. College campuses all over the country have had lots of struggles over this, and we're having them right now. North Carolina is tearing itself apart. UNC at Chapel Hill. The chancellor just lost her job over Silent Sam. One single monument to an anonymous Confederate soldier. She resigned and said, "I'll quit after commencement." And the board said, "No, you won't. You're done next week." There's a sense in which you learn a little bit about yourself sometimes when foreign reporters call and they ask something like, "So, what was this thing called the Confederacy anyway?" Oh God, you know. And by the way, my deadline's, this afternoon. Or they'll ask more carefully, why don't Americans ever get over this? Which is a good question. Why don't we ever get over this? And you end up trying to have enough time to talk to them about our problem with race, and our problem with racism, and our problem with white supremacy, and our problem with the memory of our most divisive, apocalyptic event, the Civil War. I mean, World War II was big time as well. And the world still debates how to process elements of the memory of the Holocaust and the Second World War, for sure, and a whole lot of other things. But there's a way in which the issues of our Civil War and Reconstruction have never ended, because they probably never will. I mean, a way to get your head around this is that there are 2 great kinds of issues that emerged from the Civil War. How could you end slavery and create something now called a broader freedom under the law? How can you write a 14th Amendment and make it work? How can you have Section 1 of the 14th Amendment and actually make it work on the ground? How do you conquer racism? That's the first, just live with that one. But then we have federalism. What are the proper relationships of the states to the federal government? Who gets to decide? Well, everybody does. Every generation does. Sometimes states' rights is really on the run, as it was when the Warren Court voted unanimously to declare Plessy v. Ferguson null and void. And we forget just what an act that was, what a move that was at that point, and the jurisprudence that came before that. I just reviewed a book called Unexampled Courage by a man named Gergel, a U.S. federal judge in South Carolina, all about the earlier litigation by the NAACP and others, but mostly NAACP, the heroic lawyering of the NAACP that led to Brown v. Board. Lest we forget, to conquer segregation in law was an obstacle just like trying to conquer slavery. But it took a court to say, there's federal supremacy. But what are we living now? We've been living a revival of the states' rights doctrine since Reaganism. And possibly the most rigid states' rightist on the Supreme Court is Clarence Thomas, an African American from Pinpoint, Georgia. who has a portrait of Frederick Douglass on his office wall. Frederick Douglass is his greatest hero. One of his friends sent me a personal letter, gave me actually a personal phone call, said, would you sign a copy for Justice Thomas? Yes, I know. That's it. That's what I did. I said, of course, I will. He bought the copy, he sent it to me. I wrote a nice message to Justice Thomas. I was tempted to say, sir, would you stop selectively reading Douglass? No, I didn't do it. But, you know, states' rights and federalism. What are the powers of the federal government? What are the powers of the states? That's an eternal question in our constitutional system. We don't get over that because we can't. And we don't really get over racism very well either. Every time we think we have conquered it, history just comes back around and whacks us between the eyes. Obama's election in 2008 was, for some of us, transcendent. And we thought the beginning of a new history. And it was, to a degree, till it wasn't. The monuments, you know, I have a lot of opinions. I think some of them surely should come down. I don't think any monuments and cemeteries should be taken down. If they were put there as acts of grieving in cemeteries, leave them alone. On the public square, it's a different matter, because in the public square, however you define the public square, that's where a city, a state, a government, a people is saying who they are. That is up for public debate. It is for the people of a local community or a state to decide. And states are deciding, aren't they? 5 southern states have passed, I'm sorry, I'll stop now. 5 southern states have passed laws, 5 southern states have passed laws saying no monument on public land anywhere dealing with the past that is more than 40 years old can ever be replaced without the majority vote of the state legislature. And as long as those Republicans, let's be honest, who passed those laws can keep their majorities in those states, they have authority over any monument to be taken down. North Carolina has had one bitter fight after another. I was an advisor to the commission that was supposed to assess whether to take down the 3 Confederate monuments on the State House grounds in Raleigh. And they had a great plan, actually. They were going to take them out to the outskirts of town, which is the surrender site, where Joseph Johnston surrendered to Sherman, the second major surrender of the Civil War. It's right on the edge of the city. They were going to remove them and take them there and just make a space for them, for the people who needed to go and see these Confederate monuments, but to take them off the State House ground. State legislature said, no, they may not be removed. See, it's always a matter of how do the people get to have their voice about these things. And the people, in any general sense, did not have a voice when all these monuments went up. They were put up by former Confederates, the sons and daughters of former Confederates, to honor Confederates and to honor a story, a narrative, the lost cause tradition, which by the time many of these monuments went up, especially after the turn of the century, was no longer about a lost cause at all. It was about a victorious cause, and the victorious cause was the Southern defeat of Reconstruction. Those monuments are to the defeat of Reconstruction by the white South. And all you need to do is go read some unveiling speeches to realize that. But should we be purging our past, purging our present, purging our history? No, I'm usually for facing it more than I ever am purging it. I am worried about erasure of this past, but there are ways to preserve even monuments in certain places by teaching a much better history around it. And boy, does Georgia have a problem with Stone Mountain. What do you do with a whole bloody mountain?
All right. That was excellent, by the way.
Thank you.
Wait, hold on. You got one more question. You have one more.
Here's your water, man.
David, one last question, and then we're going to go do books. Chucky, it had better be good.
If Frederick Douglass were to make a speech today, what would be his core message?
What would be Douglas's message today if he made a big speech?
If he was making a speech today, what would be the core message?
Oh, God. You know what? I don't know, of course, but I think he might go back to a speech he first gave in 1867. I think he'd do a variation. I mean, this is just one guess. I think he might do a variation on a speech he called the Composite Nation. Because we're in a moment right now, you all know this, of extreme conflict, polarization. We're divided over this identity and that identity. We're divided over everything. And he would have seen that as an opportunity to resurrect the speech that he gave, which was, he writes the speech, you need to remember, at the heyday of Reconstruction. The 13th and 14th Amendments have been passed. The Reconstruction Acts have been put in place in the South. Almost everything seems possible now out of the triumph of the war. And he writes this speech that's really a quite modern imagination of a multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-religious nation of peoples all somehow managing to live together under the rule of law. It sounds like a multiculturalism convention of the 1990s. It sounds like a diversity convention for faculty today in schools, you know, celebration of our diversity. But it's a very serious analysis of how no nation's ever managed this. We have the chance, he says in this speech, to create something really new. He never gave that speech again, basically, after about 1871, 72, because Reconstruction was falling apart. But it's an amazingly modern projection of the kind of country we keep telling ourselves we ought to be, could be, can be, and still can be. I just have a guess that he might go back to that one and do some variation on it for our miserably conflicted moment.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Thank you. Excellent. Thank you so much.